Welcome, everyone, to our Tuesday night session on the Sweatworking Summit Week. I'm Kristen. I'm the Chief Content Officer at aSweatLife.com. You've got other members of the aSweatLife team on here too. We have Kelly and Gina, and I haven't seen Marie come through yet, but she might be out walking her adorable golden retriever Finn at the time being. We're so excited about the presentation that we have that we're about to start with you guys today with Erin and Kelly. Before we hand it over to Erin and Sarah, we want to thank the brands and the partners that are helping to make the Sweatworking Summit possible. I'm just going to run through them real quick. We had help from our friends at Tonal, at UFOS, at NYX, Les Mills, who you'll see in the workout tomorrow morning, Boone Health, Undone, Evrani, Wander Beauty, Curious Elixirs, August, R & Co, Tone House, aSutra, Mad Tasty, Wordiful, Half Day, Athletic Brewing, and Olive and June, who you will also see tomorrow at our midday Manny break. So make sure you give them some love on social media if you are enjoying them as part of your summit box. So for today's workshop, we are going to hear about healing your mind from Erin Brown and Sarah Kelly. So we're going to hear from them. They're going to give us the tools that we need to take care of our mental health in ways that'll give us clarity to do the things, the big hard things that you have set your mind to. We're going to focus on our mental health in this session to give ourselves the space to set boundaries and process everything that has happened over the last year or so. To tell you a little bit more about our speakers, we've got Erin Brown. Erin, you want to give a wave?
Hey, everyone.
There we go. She's a well-being coach, and she's going to kick us off by leading a 45-minute or so virtual workshop about setting boundaries. So we're excited to learn more from her there. And then we're going to hand it over to Sarah Kelly. She is a licensed social worker and a certified alcohol and drug counselor with her master's in social work from Loyola. And she's currently working as an individual and group therapist for Clarity Clinic Chicago. So they are going to sort of tag team this. We're going to start with Erin, then hand over to Sarah. Without further ado, I'm going to let them take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen to present a few slides. So this session, I'm really going to focus on how to feel confident in embodying your boundaries. And the reason why this topic of unapologetic boundaries is important to me is because I am someone who has personally struggled with burnout a couple of times earlier on in my career, and really had to go through the process of creating boundaries so that I could take care of my health, so I can focus on the things that were truly important to me and just feel well and whole at a holistic level. This is something that comes up all the time in my coaching work with my clients. Whether they're trying to eat healthier, work out more, reduce stress, whatever it is, I often find that boundaries for my clients who are very busy, high-performing women, boundaries always comes up as a barrier that stands in the way. So that's why this topic has been so important to me personally, and something that's really important in the work that I do. So I want to start off by sharing a quote from a therapist who I follow on Instagram. I think she's great. And when I saw this quote, "The presence or lack of boundaries determines your quality of life." I saw this a while back, and it's so simple, but it made so much sense to me. And I honestly hadn't thought about it that way before, but it's so true. I mean, think about it. When you don't have boundaries, it's hard for you to have the time, energy, the space to focus on the things that truly matter to you. It can impact your ability to express yourself, to really work on the hard, difficult things that we're talking about throughout this summit. And when you think about the vision for your life, the life you want to create, often boundaries can be so supportive in making sure that you are able to have the resources to make that happen. So here's a definition of boundaries that I'd like to share that I found in the Cambridge Dictionary. So it's defined as real or imagined line that marks the edge or limit of something. It's the limit of what someone considers to be acceptable. It's the limit of a subject or principle. Now, you'll notice that the word limit is used a lot in this definition. And when you think about it, it really reflects the fact that our boundaries are the limit at which we will allow or not allow something, the limit to which we are available for a certain experience or not available for a certain experience. It's the limit to which we have resources, whether those are material resources or energetic resources, to live the life that we want, to have what we want, to achieve the things that we are going after. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go to this next slide. And here are types of boundaries. And here's what I would like you to think about as I'm going through these types of boundaries. I'd love for you to type in the chat which one, or it could be more than one, multiple, that you find yourself struggling with today. So I find this to be a pretty inclusive list, and I got this from a really great book that you should check out, The Art of Showing Up by Rachel Wilkerson Miller. And these are the typical types of boundaries that we struggle with. So we're all very familiar with body or physical space. You know, we all know what it feels like when someone is a little bit too close to us, or, you know, someone is making us feel uncomfortable. Physical boundaries really are just everything related to the space around our physical body. And it could also even be how people talk about our bodies. Boundaries around, you know, what people say to us about our bodies is a boundary. And when that boundary is not being honored, or we're not honoring it for ourselves, it really impacts the relationship we have with our bodies, the ability for us to accept our bodies. It also can impact our level of safety in our bodies if we are in situations where our physical boundaries are not being honored by other people. And then there's home and belongings, which when you think about it, it's, you know, all your things, all your physical things. And this is a pretty obvious one. And when those boundaries are not being honored in terms of home and physical belongings, that's also a situation where we can feel a lack of safety, a lack of privacy. That also goes into the privacy one, which I'll cover later. But this is where we think about our space where we feel safe to just be, where we feel safe with the things that we own to be ours, and to be, you know, sort of things when you think about people you've lived with, whether it's family members, spouses, significant others, you know, kind of what that means for you in terms of honoring those boundaries that make you feel safe in the relationship and safe with in your home. And then we go into money, which is a boundary that, you know, not a lot of people think of, but it's come up with a few clients of mine, especially, who struggle with boundaries in terms of, you know, and this honestly covers a wide range of topics, but it could be anything from being asked for money repeatedly in a way that makes you uncomfortable. This also can often apply to business owners if they feel that, you know, people aren't willing to pay them what they think they're worth for their services or their products. You could be crossing a boundary with someone if you're trying to get them to go down on their prices. And that's a boundary that I find comes up with my clients who are, you know, entrepreneurs and want to feel confident with the fees that, or the, you know, what they're charging, the prices that they're charging to their potential customers or clients. It's also something that at the most basic level comes up with our budget. When you think about a budget, I mean, that is really setting a boundary and where your money goes. And the extent to which you honor your budget impacts your savings, how much you can invest. Oh, thanks for adding this poll, and so forth. Another boundary is time, and that's one that I know we're all familiar with. Are we setting aside time for the things that truly matter to us? When you think of it, it's so easy for us to be distracted, to, you know, work through commitments that we've made. You know, working out is a big one that I know many of us can relate to. Are we honoring the time that we set aside to do the things that we committed to for ourselves? And obviously the impact of not honoring that time boundary is that we don't have the opportunity to really, you know, maximize our time to achieve our goals. It's really all about the time resources we have for the things that are important. Energy and attention is a big one. So that one is really difficult because often it involves boundaries that we have with ourselves. Time is one, but energy and attention can be, our commitment to paying attention to things that really serve us, that really nourish us. A big example is social media. If you are used to scrolling on Instagram, I know I can get down an Instagram rabbit hole often. And you get to a point where you wonder, is this really serving me to continue doing this? This can also happen often when it comes to watching the news. You want to be informed, but up to a certain point, you realize that you start to maybe get really upset and you need to take a break to, really lift your spirits and focus on other things that can help balance out the things that we're hearing in the news that don't make us feel good. And the last boundary is privacy. Privacy is a big one. Privacy can, come up with our ideas. Especially if we have big goals, and we may be careful about who we share that with, because we want to be focused on sharing that with the people who are going to be the most supportive of us. Privacy really comes into play when it comes to just sharing our inner world with people we trust. So those are, 6 boundaries. I know it was a lot, but I would love for everyone to respond to the top boundaries that they found are impacting them today. So I see energy and attention is the highest one, and then time comes in second. Okay, this is great. Yeah, energy and attention is huge in time, especially, I would say now in this world where we're just spending so much time at home, really, like, we have all the time in the world, but at the same time, sometimes we don't feel like we have enough. And because our lives are different and we are at home much of the time, we're finding ways to spend our, what do we want to focus our energy on? We also have been going through a lot of turmoil as a society. So what we spend our energy and attention on has been huge. There's been a lot of things happening in the world that, are stressful, cause a lot of anxiety, upsetting. I know that's definitely affected me. And what we spend our time tending to can impact our ability to really pour into ourselves. So here's how boundaries serve us. They empower us to create the experiences we want in our lives. They protect us and our resources, and I use resources a lot, either material, like money was an example, or mental and emotional resources when we think about our energy, our emotions, the emotions that we have available to us to deal with the hard things in our lives. And they really, boundaries protect us from harm. They also create a foundation for healthy relationship with others and our relationship with ourselves. So the question is, why can't boundaries be easy? Because we have to acknowledge that they can be really hard to set. Sometimes it just feels like, it could be scary, uncomfortable. It often involves confronting someone or changing the dynamic of a relationship. Sometimes it means we have to face uncomfortable things for ourselves by setting boundaries with ourselves and focusing on the hard things that we have to get through. So I want to talk about survival-based conditioning. So we are all social creatures, and based on how we were nurtured and also just who we are as, human beings, we want to feel safe. We want to feel a sense of love and belonging in our communities and our families. And, based on the society we grew up in, based on the families that we grew up in, we may not have always felt that we had enough of the safety we wanted, related to love and belonging, related to our esteem in a community or in a family unit. So boundaries or the lack of boundaries can often show up for a few reasons. People pleasing is a big one. Definitely comment if this is something that impacts you. I know this is something I've struggled with. And people pleasing comes from a fear of losing love, at its most basic level. We don't want to disappoint people. We want to show up for the people who need things from us. And this is something that has a positive intention. We want to be there for people, but when we do it to an extent that we're not able to show up for ourselves, then it can leave us depleted. It can lead to burnout, and it can prevent us from focusing on the things that we need for our own evolution and growth. Perfectionism is another one. That's also another one I personally have struggled with. So when you think of pursuing perfection, focusing on being flawless, it can that took away from other things that were important from you. Perfectionism also robs you of your peace of mind. Perfectionism distracts you from things that can be helping you make progress and keeps you stuck in focusing on things that, or obsessing over things that really make it hard for you to gain momentum and move forward. So perfectionism can actually keep you kind of stuck. But the positive intention of perfectionism is that we want to prove our self-worth. So it does have a positive intention, but when it gets out of hand, it can prevent us from having the boundaries we need on our time and our energy to gain momentum on the things that are important to us. Procrastination is another big one. And not many people think that it relates to boundaries, but it does, because I mean, the biggest thing that procrastination does is that it can, really put us in situations where we're really unnecessarily stressed out because we try to fit in things that we're trying to do within a shorter period of time. It can impact, so it impacts our stress level, it impacts our relationship with time, it impacts our ability to really focus on the things that are important to us when we should be. And so procrastination also impacts our boundaries because we're not able to set aside the appropriate time needed to process things, to work through things that, the goals that we're trying to achieve. So procrastination is a big, I would say, a big inhibitor of us setting up boundaries. And then the last one is pushing away. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because, oftentimes for those of us who have set boundaries, we sometimes get confused between boundaries and barriers. So we may think that we are setting a boundary with someone, but we may actually be setting up a barrier. And I want to talk about that because this one, pushing away, is a little bit different from the three I mentioned before. This is more so a fear-based response of trying to keep ourselves safe. So if we experience some type of, could be trauma or could be just an experience that hurt us and we feel that we need to put up walls to protect us, we could be pushing away all experiences that we want. And the positive intention of that is that we're pushing away repeating things that happen in our past that we don't want to happen again, but it can cause us to not filter in the good things that we want to receive. So now I'm going to talk about turning these fear-based responses, these survival-based responses, into opportunities to set boundaries. So first is people-pleasing. And a great way that I advise my clients to get out of the habit of people-pleasing and set up boundaries for themselves is to focus on pursuing pleasure and peace. By pursuing your pleasure, the things that bring you joy, the things that light you up, and the things that give you peace of mind, you are then able to turn the attention to what is nourishing for you, what fulfills you, and take the focus off a little bit less than on pleasing others. And this is a great way to create a boundary if you actually carve out time in your schedule or make it a priority to find ways to prioritize your joy first, to prioritize whatever it is you need, whether that could be, meditating in the morning before jumping into morning meetings, or, blocking off time during lunch to cook yourself a meal if you enjoy cooking. Just think of ways you can create boundaries where you are focusing on your pleasure and your peace of mind and less on being, always on for other people. So for perfectionism, a great way to counteract that is focus on progression. Rather than getting things right 100% the first time, focus on making progress. And a great way to do this is to, set boundaries on your time and focus less on the final result, but focus more on what you can do to create progress to get closer to your goal. So a great example I like to use is, setting a timer for, a project you want to work on, and say, instead of focusing on this presentation has to be perfect, reframing that to be, for this next 30 minutes, I'm going to focus on this, portion of the presentation. I'm going to get it in a place to where, I feel great about it and I can share it with others for feedback, rather than focusing on getting it right the first time and agonizing on it. And in that way, you also are allowing yourself to receive help. So another thing about focusing on progress is that it allows you to take breaks, receive help from others, and it sets boundaries on the amount of time you're spending on something so that you're not really burning your energetic resources. You're not burning out and running out of time on the things that are important to you that you also need to spend time on. And then there's procrastination. And so persistence is that's the way to really get at beating procrastination. And this is actually going to be somewhat of a similar tactic to perfectionism, because I feel like procrastination can be the other side of the coin to perfectionism, because with procrastination, we're really avoiding something that we think is going to be pleasant. We're afraid to confront something unpleasant. And what persistence does is really get us in the mindset of tackling something in little chunks so that we can feel better and more equipped to deal with something that feels scary, that feels really big. And so what I advise my clients to do is to focus more on just breaking something into smaller pieces, spending less time on it, but spreading out something over a longer period of time or time frame so that you can make progress. But you're persisting, you're not stopping, you're not staying stuck in stagnation. It gets you out of your head and able to get into action and breaks the task up into smaller parts, or breaks the goal up into smaller parts so that you can tackle it. I think this also comes in handy when it comes to difficult emotional situations that you're dealing with, because it allows you to not feel like you have to tackle, big, hairy things that are bothering you. You sort of give yourself space to focus on little pieces of it so that you feel less intimidated. And then the last one, pushing away. So pulling in is the opposite, Are you pulling in the experiences you want? And this is an opportunity for you to really reflect on, am I setting a barrier or a boundary in a situation? I would say it most often comes up in interpersonal situations. It could come up in relationships with family, friends. It can come up in relationships with new people, interacting with new people we haven't met before. But how can we slowly, create ways of feeling safe to pull in the experiences we want, but also setting up boundaries so that we can feel safe as we're doing that. And we can feel some sense of control that, we're not putting ourselves in a situation to repeat the things that have happened before in our past that have been kind of scary for us. So I'd like you to reflect on a goal, and this could be, something for your career. It could be something personal. It could just be something that you're really trying to work on to, be better as a person, evolve, and think of something that is in need of a supportive boundary to help you make progress or create momentum. So I'm going to give you a series of journal prompts, and in the next slide, I'll share a series of questions, and I want you to just take a few minutes. I'll we can all go on mute and I can give you some brainstorming music to think about these questions. And then we'll think about strategies to address it so we can sort of reframe it and feel more empowered with how we deal with it. So the first set of prompts, I'll read these. I want you to answer these and just know that one of these questions may apply to you, or all four of these questions may apply to you. It really depends on the goal and, really what's happening in your life right now. But the first question is, who am I trying to please by not setting a boundary? How is my pursuit of perfection sabotaging my ability to set a boundary? Is my lack of boundary enabling my inaction or procrastination? And do I have a barrier limiting my growth where a boundary would better serve me? So I'm going to give you 4 minutes to answer this. Now, as I said, some of you may only have one question that applies to you, so you may go through this quickly, but some of you, all these questions may apply. So I want to make sure you have the time you need. Okay, so I'm curious if there's anyone who is brave and wants to share what insights or ahas they may have had from these questions.
This is Alex. I'll go. I guess question number 3, I'm learning that like my lack of boundaries always caused me to put everybody else before myself. And I even think about that when it comes to like volunteering. Is like how much more volunteering do I need to do before I feel confident in myself that I know how to do my job, or even interning. So I think I need to it's both like a boundaries and a confidence thing. Need to get there.
Yeah. Do you think there might be some people pleasing in that as well?
Absolutely. And so much people pleasing in there. I can't say no.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think, reflect on that further, why do I feel like I have to do that? Is there some part of me that is concerned about proving my worth, having, maybe even imposter syndrome. I feel like a lot of us, we struggle with imposter syndrome, and we feel like we have to do the most to show that we are adding value. So that comes up a lot, and I definitely can relate to it. I'm sure a lot of people on this Zoom can relate to it as well. So we're going to just go to the next set, or the last set of journal exercises. And I'm going to give you some time to think about, after reflecting on those previous questions, what boundary would allow me to prioritize my pleasure or peace? What boundary would allow me to focus on progress over perfection? Which boundary would make it easier for me to persist rather than procrastinate? And how would setting or communicating a boundary allow me to pull in the experience I want or the goal that I am working toward? So I'm going to give you 4 minutes for this as well. And also we'll ask, just a heads up, if anyone wants to share their insights from this. So I will start the timer now, and you have 4 minutes to focus on these questions. Okay, so we can come back, and I figured I would start this one by sharing an example from my personal life. And if anyone wants to chime in, I would love to have a couple of folks answer these questions. But number one, I would say, is a boundary that came up for me around the holidays. And I feel like a lot of people can relate to this, but you sort of have a threshold you have in terms of how much time you can spend with certain family members who may be a bit negative, or, even toxic, to be honest. And something that I had to do, a boundary I had to set in terms of prioritizing my peace, is not being present for as long as maybe they would have preferred, because I needed to make sure that I was also prioritizing my peace of mind in that situation. And also making sure that, it's someone who I want to stay in a relationship with. So making sure I have boundaries where I can still spend time with that person, but also realize that I have a limit when I have to step back and, step away and be by myself so that I can refuel and re-energize myself and kind of give myself that nourishment that I might need from that situation. Does anyone else want to share a boundary that they came up with, or a boundary that they want to put in place after answering these questions?
I'll share.
Cool.
So I've been thinking of communicating with my manager at work the need for just carving out a little bit more time for myself in the late mornings for fitness and going to the gym. I know that's the time when it's the least popular. And so I think that's important in terms of staying safe, but still prioritizing myself. And so negotiating what that looks like and whether that's eating my lunch at my desk afterwards and being open to feedback, but just communicating that I think is an important step that I'm working towards.
That's so great. Thank you, Stevie, for sharing that. And I think during this time, especially of COVID and everyone's sort of, whether you're working from home or not, things have changed, right? And even when the time you want to go to the gym has changed because you want to be safe. And I think it's a great opportunity, if you haven't already, for everyone on the call to create working norms with your team. Where you can sort of say, hey, these are the times when I need to work out, or this is the time, where I need to do e-learning with my kids, or this is the time, whatever. So you can make agreements and feel comfortable knowing that, okay, I can rely on this person at this time, but I also know that this person consistently will need this time to step away. And so I think this time in particular in this past year, given the way we work, has been a little bit different for many of us. Setting up those norms with a team and, approaching our managers, approaching other people we collaborate with to let them know up front, hey, this is what you can expect from me. And this is really important to me. I think that's so important. And I think also because of everything that's happened, people have a lot more compassion for that. So that's a great example. I want to segue into Sarah's presentation because she will take you more through setting boundaries and how to work through the uncomfortable feelings that may come up with that, so that you can really make a stand for yourself, because it's one thing to say, this is what I'm going to do, but I think in your work with Sarah, you'll really feel confident about following through and actually putting that into action. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. I just want to quickly share how you can find me. I'm Live Well with Erin on Instagram. That's my website name. You can email me, hello@livewellwitherin. I definitely look forward to connecting with you. And I will hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Erin. And Erin's right. Everything that she spoke about today is going to be really useful for us in our conversation about how therapy and mental health care really fits into all of these types of conversations. So let me share my screen. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is first what therapy is, how we can use it to foster our personal growth, and then talk about how therapy can support you in setting boundaries like Erin was talking about. So yeah, let's get started. But before we can talk about what therapy is, it's really valuable for us to think about what therapy is not. So this is a picture of what some of us might think therapy is. There's some humor in this. I hope you all can find a little bit of a joke. But first we have a picture of Hannibal Lecter. So I didn't realize this. I'm not a horror film person, but Hannibal Lecter is actually a psychiatrist and a serial killer on the side. So just know that if you're seeing a psychiatrist, your psychiatrist is not also a serial killer, most likely. But that is one media representation of what someone who provides mental health care looks like. When you look at the second picture, an example of what therapy is a book called Group. So this book was recently in Reese Witherspoon's book club, And I've seen quite a bit of differing opinions on this book and how this book discusses therapy. And I think it's valuable to reflect on. This book is actually a memoir, so it is speaking about one person's experience of therapy. But do know that the therapist, the psychiatrist who's portrayed in this book, has some interesting techniques that aren't quite typical. So for example, he tells the group members they can't be confidential with each other. So that might prevent someone from seeing a therapist if they don't trust that their privacy is protected. So know that with group, right? Like that's not actually how most group therapists work. Our third representation of a therapist is Dr. Sean McGuire from Good Will Hunting. So while this is a much loved book, Dr. Sean McGuire is a little bit different than what a therapist actually is because his boundaries with Will are fairly poor. For example, he shares quite a bit with Will about his personal life, and sometimes it can be really valuable to keep that in mind, that generally speaking, your therapist is not going to tell them about their personal horror stories. That can create some tension with that therapist. Additionally, the Dr. Phil, someone we all know, maybe some of you love him. Important to note that Dr. Phil does have a degree in psychology. He hasn't actually renewed his license in several years, so he can't legally practice therapy. But something important to think about with therapists is that if your therapist is using your experience for entertainment, definitely should be valuable and important to know that they're not really there for you, they're there for themselves. So those are some things to keep in mind. So we'll transition here. Another thing that I think is valuable to think about when we think about therapy is what our own perceptions are. So when I think about therapy, I asked people on Instagram, did an Instagram poll, what are your thoughts on therapy? So I'm just going to put a disclaimer out there. Of course, these responses are fairly biased. Everyone who answered my poll knew they were telling me, and they also know that I'm a therapist. So I'm sure that everyone who responded was very kind. But the first comment that we have here is therapy is a way to explore, practice, and learn about strategies for coping in a safe and unpressured environment. I think that's a really valuable way to think about therapy. I definitely practice therapy as a therapist with my clients to help them explore and practice their strategies for coping. And the goal is to create a safe environment where they don't feel pressured to do so. Quite a few of the answers that I got were trends along the second and fourth statements, which are that therapists are life saviors or life-saving. Now, I definitely don't want to invalidate that. For a lot of people, their therapist was a part of an experience in their life that was saving. What I do think is valuable to think about is if your therapist tells you that they're going to save your life, or if your therapist is saying that they are lifesavers, that might mean that there's an issue with their own boundaries, right? Generally, therapy is useful for us to think about how can this person support me along my process? But if they say, I'm going to save your life, that might be an indicator of some professional boundary issues. And the third point here is that some are really great at what they do, and some are not the best, so it's daunting to decide who to see. And I think that's a really valid thought, right? Some therapists are really wonderful. Some therapists, as in all professions, might be problematic, right? Or one therapist style might match what you're really looking for, and their style may not match what they're looking for. So I do think it's valuable to think about, what your experience is like with a therapist, and to trust yourself. If you're working with someone and they're not supporting you in the way you need to be supported, it's okay to take a step back. So now that we've taken a look at what our media representations are of therapy, what our own thoughts are about therapy, let's talk about what therapy actually is. So the Cambridge definition of psychotherapy is the treatment of mental illness by discussing someone's problems instead of using drugs or operations. My personal definition, and of course this is my definition, is partnering with a client or clients to unpack experiences and histories that contribute to emotional and behavioral patterns to pursue improved personal well-being. So what this means is that in my work or in the work of a therapist is we're working with you, right? So we aren't going to solve your problems for you, but we're going to think about what are the skills that you already have? What are the skills that you're hoping to grow in? What are the skills you're hoping to build? What are some of those barriers that might be in your life? And how can we unpack that to work towards what your own well-being and your own growth is going to look like? All right, so I'm seeing some things in the chat about psychiatrists versus psychologists, and I think those are a lot of great questions. So we'll talk about who can actually practice therapy, which is kind of aligned with a lot of what you guys are asking. So there's a wide variety of people that can practice therapy, but I think that the thing I believe is most valuable is that if someone's offering you therapy, they do need to be licensed. So psychiatrists generally do provide prescriptions, but there are some psychiatrists who do still practice therapy, whether it's group therapy, individual therapy. But that license that they have is a medical doctorate, doctor of osteopathy, so that MD, DO. Additionally, nurse practitioners and some PAs also are able to practice therapy, depending on if they have the appropriate licensure. Additionally, psychologists who have a master's degree or a doctorate in psychology are also able to practice therapy. Counselors, marriage and family therapists, social workers like myself have those credentials to be able to practice therapy. And why I say it's important to have that is that anyone who has a credential is required to keep you safe. So that means that we're required to keep your information confidential, and we're also required to mandate any or to report anything that might keep you unsafe. So whether that's harm yourself or whether it's someone has been harmed, we're required to report it. If someone doesn't have that licensure, they're not required to keep your information private, not required to keep you safe like that. But I do think this is also a challenge in the field of therapy because getting these degrees can be super expensive and that's not accessible for everyone. So there's a lot of people who would love to practice this work, but don't necessarily have the privilege of time, the privilege of money, the privilege of access, whether that's with their family, to be able to practice that higher degree. And I do think that's a real disservice within the therapeutic space because we do need that diversity. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you are looking for a therapist. All right. So we know who can practice therapy. Let's think about who can go to therapy. And I would argue that anybody can go to therapy. I saw earlier in the chat, someone said they're really grateful to be having this conversation around mental health. And I think that's a really valuable thought to add in. Because for many, many years and still to this day, therapy can be pretty stigmatized, right? So many people might think that the only people who can or should go to therapy is someone who has an experience of a severe mental illness or an experience of trauma. But therapy can be a space for anybody. It can be a space for someone who's going through an acute issue in their life, with their family. It can be for anyone who's working through a job challenge. With COVID, I've seen a huge increase in the number of people seeking therapy because it's just this massive transition that we've all experienced. Our political sphere has created quite a bit of distress. So I think therapy is really something that can be utilized for anyone. So know that that is a resource that's available for everybody. So let's think about what types of therapy are available. I think that our general idea of what therapy is that I'm going to go sit in someone's office, I'm going to sit on a couch, and they're going to let me listen and cry about my feelings. And that certainly is a space that's available. But there's so many different types of therapy, which I think is really valuable. A one-on-one conversation isn't necessarily everybody's favorite way of communicating, and it's also not everyone's best way of communicating. It doesn't always feel safe to sit face-to-face with somebody else and share your challenges with them. So for some people, talk therapy is where it is, but there's also group therapy. There's also couples therapy if you're experiencing challenges in your partnership, family therapy for challenges with your family members. There's sex therapy and you're having challenges with your experience of sexual relationships. Movement therapy is really valuable because some people, and I saw in today's question about when are you feeling kind of you're most connected to yourself, a lot of people talk about movement, right? So movement therapy can be a really useful tool for a lot of people. Art therapy is something that I use a lot in my sessions. I have a lot of clients who really struggle to express themselves verbally. So we'll draw or paint or write poetry about whatever it is that's going on in their life, because that feels like a more authentic expression of themselves. There's also animal assisted therapy and so many other kinds of therapies. So know that if talking face to face is not your thing, there's so many options available for you that you can use to express yourself. So talked a lot about what therapy is, but a question that I hear a lot from friends, family members is how to actually find a therapist, because it can be kind of a confusing process. So if you do have insurance, it can be really useful to just contact your insurance and figure out who is covered. So earlier when I showed all of the different licenses that people may have, some people may only be able to see a social worker. Some people might only be able to see a counselor. So it's really helpful to think about where you can actually be seen. Can also research online. Psychology Today is a great resource where you can type in your location, what type of insurance you have. If you're looking for someone who is of the same race to you, a same gender to you, similar age, Psychology Today has all of those filters so that you can research that online. When I first started seeing a therapist, I actually got a referral from my primary care provider. That was the way that I had to go about it to get it covered by insurance. So know that that's always an option. And then there's also word of mouth referrals from friends. I know a lot of people say, oh, I found you because my friend goes to Clarity Clinic and they said they like Clarity. So know that you could reach out to a friend and ask, who do you go see? Where do you go? And they might have resources for you. Later on in the slideshow, I have several links to different ways to find a therapist, especially if you're looking for someone who's affirming of your sexuality or gender. If you're looking for someone who is of a similar ethnic or racial background to you, there's a lot of different resources out there who can get you connected. So there's that available as well. So now this is where we can have some fun. And we're going to try out a group therapy exercise. So as a therapist, I would be remiss if I just talked at you about therapy without giving you an opportunity to talk yourself. So what we'll do is kind of piggyback off of what Erin has already started us with. So I encourage you to pull out your notebook and we'll do a group therapy exercise. So also as a therapist, I'd be remiss if I didn't set some norms and expectations before we did this activity. So first and foremost, confidentiality is definitely something that we need to consider. And with that, knowing that this is a recorded presentation, so know that if you do share something, it'll potentially be shared with more people than are just viewing this presentation right now. So keep that in mind, right? Like we talked about with boundaries, privacy is certainly something that a lot of people really value and are important with. So while I certainly encourage you to share, I know that privacy is really valuable. I also ask that everybody provide respect for each other. So respect doesn't mean you have to agree, right? It just means that if someone shares something that you disagree with, respecting what they have to say and being kind within a response. And then active listening, right? So oftentimes what I love about group therapy is that we get more from what we hear than from what we say. So if someone is sharing something with you, and you're listening, try to listen not to respond, but listen to understand, just so that we can get that opportunity to learn. So with that, does anybody have any other ideas for any group norms that we want to set before we get started with our activity? You can share them vocally or share them in the chat. Very much understand if no one has anything they'd like to add. So generally speaking, group therapy doesn't involve an audience of like 85. Generally, it's more a group of 8 to 10 to 15. So how we're going to go about this is that for each question, I encourage everybody to kind of journal about it. And then if you would like to share, you can type your name in the chat and I'll call on you and then we'll talk. And for each question, we'll kind of have 2 to 3 people share depending on time. And then AK Reyes also shared speak time along with active listening, giving others opportunity to speak rather than take up speaking time. I think that's really valuable. So one thing that my partner is also a therapist, and something he said that is really valuable to me, because I tend to be the person that always wants to share, is thinking about, is what I'm sharing actually valuable for the group, or is it only valuable for me? So when you think about, if you want to share, is this going to be something that's valuable for the group? But also knowing that when you want to share something, it might be valuable just to say it off your chest, right? Just to speak it to the audience. So keep that in mind when you want to share. But thank you, AK, for pointing that out. I appreciate the addition. So with every group, I always start with a check-in question. So for our check-in question, what's a boundary that you've been needing to set but are struggling to? So maybe take just a handful of moments to think about what this boundary might be. And if you are wanting to share, I encourage you to put your name out in the chat. So in my groups, I always check in with a check-in question that I ask my group members, because it's unfair for me to ask a question that I can't answer myself, right? So a boundary that I've been needing to set but might be struggling to is very much aligned with Erin's presentation of energy and attention. I always want to be furthering my career. I want to be furthering my relationships. So I say yes a lot. And I'm really working on saying no. So thank you. Gina said boundary she's needing to set is paying herself first in joy. And I love that. Stephanie shared boundary needing to set work during certain hours of the day only. Winnie setting boundaries with their partner. Asking for alone time in a pandemic, setting boundaries with money. Someone saying partner's family going through a crisis, boundaries at work. Does anyone recognize any of these boundaries as stuff that they're needing or can relate to, right?
I think chiming in here, Sarah, this is Gina. I think the boundary of asking for alone time when living with someone has been hard for me too. And I like need it. So I think that resonated with me as well.
Yes, I think that's really valid, especially if it's a partner, right?
I can share too. I was going to say, everyone on my team at work has a family, like younger kids at home. So their boundaries have been a little bit more respected. And I feel like sometimes at work, even though you don't have kids at home, that doesn't mean you also don't need your evening and weekends. So that's something I'm personally working on, trying to get our team to be better at, regardless of family status.
Yeah, Katie, I think that's so important. I think our culture recognizes certain lifestyles, family setups as requiring kind of that freedom or that boundary. But I have a lot of clients who are young in their 20s who are single and living alone, and their work is requiring them to work these absolutely unreasonable hours because they don't have anything else to be doing. But we don't have to be doing things 24 hours a day. So Katie, I think that's really valuable input. Yeah, thank you, everyone. So now we can do a boundary setting exercise. So thinking about the boundaries that Erin was presenting on, and also thinking about some of the thoughts that you came up with in your check-in question. Our first question is identifying what are some of your limits. So that might be some internal and external barriers, right? So an external barrier might be, for example, if you are living with a partner and you're needing to set a boundary of having that alone time, an external barrier might be what their expectations are of you and whether or not you're able to meet those expectations and whether or not those are fair expectations. An internal barrier might be an emotion that you're experiencing regarding setting that boundary. So is there fear in setting that boundary with that partner? Is there guilt or shame associated in setting that boundary? So what are some limits that people are recognizing in setting boundaries that might bring some of that joy that you're seeking or bring some of that peace?
I think when it comes to boundaries, especially with like friends and partners, one of the biggest barriers is just that you're afraid of hurting feelings.
Yeah.
You want to be nice. I think women especially want to be nice.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes.
I can chime in here. I guess I struggle with even identifying because I've never truly set boundaries in my life. I'm like identify with being a perfectionist, people pleaser, all of the things. And I guess I struggle even internally to identify what a boundary even should be and like applying that to a particular scenario. I don't know if anyone else relates to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really self-aware and insightful recognition that you can have, right? We're talking about setting boundaries and recognizing barriers, but even asking yourself the question, what would a boundary even look like for me? What would a barrier even look like for me? That's a great question. And I encourage you to just reflect on that. And I think that's a lot of self-awareness and a lot of insight. So now let's think about what are some emotions that are coming up for you as you reflect on setting boundaries. What I just heard was the emotion of uncertainty, right? Lack of clarity. I've heard some guilt, some shame, but think about what are some other emotions. And when you think about emotions, try avoiding labeling your thoughts as emotions, right? So I regularly say, oh, I felt like they weren't listening to me. And that's not an emotion, right? Like that's a thought. So when you think about your emotion, instead of thinking, for example, oh, I feel like they're not listening to me, say I'm feeling like I'm unheard right now. So if you recognize that you're talking about thoughts, try to change that into an emotion. Anxiety, that's a huge emotion when it comes to boundaries. Some self-doubt. Okay. Someone put into the chat that naming emotions is so tough. And I think that is so true. When I go to my own therapist about 30 times a session, he says, is that a thought? What's the actual emotion? Which is why I had the kind of clarifier there, because it's super true. And Kelsey put in the chat that an emotion wheel is helpful. And I think that's valuable as well. So I encourage you to continue to reflect on what emotions do come up for you when you are thinking about setting boundaries, and to honor that emotion. It's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel fear. It's okay to feel these things and to recognize that those feelings are valid. It's really scary to set a boundary, especially if you don't have a lot of practice doing it. It's okay to acknowledge a barrier, even if it brings up some anger, right? Sometimes our barriers are socially constructed barriers or socially enforced barriers that we don't have control over, right? So it's okay to allow yourself to feel valid in those emotions. So with that, give yourself permission to set boundaries. Earlier in the chat, I saw someone talking about forgiving themselves as a boundary. And I think that's super valuable and super true. It's okay to set a boundary. It's okay to put yourself first, especially if that's going to allow you to move forward in achieving your goals and being an authentic version of yourself. So last, I want everyone to kind of consider your environment and share about what pieces of their environment are contributing to or moving against your ability to set a boundary. So what that might mean is, if your boundary is asking for time, asking for alone space in this COVID time, but maybe you live in a 1-bedroom apartment or a studio with your partner. Yes, Tiffany literally read my mind. So that might be something that really makes it challenging to set that boundary. So that might mean asking your partner or asking your roommate, like, hey, can I have this space for a certain period of time? Or at least allowing yourself to have the emotion that you have about that experience. Sharing a studio with a boyfriend, I've had that experience. It's challenging. Give yourself time, right? Especially right now with the winter, with the snow, it's hard to get out of that space. But definitely kind of allow yourself to recognize that. But also think about with your environment, what will help you create that boundary. So I recently learned that there's a way to use your headphones to watch television. So if you need quiet time, but your partner's wanting to watch television, finding a way to use your headphones to do that. Or if you're needing if you want to cook yourself a meal, that can be something as well. Anybody have any other thoughts that they want to share with the group about parts of their environment that they found to be really helpful? So I'm seeing lots of kind of problem solving tools in the chat, which is awesome. But things that are helpful for your environment and setting a boundary are things that might be kind of getting in the way of setting a boundary or might be a barrier to setting a boundary. Headphones are essential. Disconnecting from my phone or social media. Talking about volume of television.
We have in my home, we have a bathtub, which I feel really lucky to have. So I set that as like the space where I wind down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some self-care. Someone mentioned doing errands by themselves. I know oftentimes ahead of quarantine or ahead of COVID, a lot of us would spend that time with a partner, spend that time with a roommate or with a family member. But I know that that can be really valuable to do that alone. I saw earlier someone having challenges kind of disconnecting from work because your workspace is your home space. So if you can find a way to make your workspace authentically that, right? Even if it's like a small closet where you shove a desk into it and kind of can close that up at the end of the day, I think that's a valuable thing to do. Do not disturb. That's great. Turning off notifications, also a good boundary. Yeah, so everyone keep putting those tools into the chat. I think that's a great idea. Lots of great ideas in here. Okay. So for our checkout question, which is similar to what we're already doing, what's an actionable step that you can take this week in service of setting your boundaries? So think about what's something that is manageable and reasonable that you can do this week. So for example, if your boundary is related to asking for time, for alone time, but you've never had that conversation with a partner before, maybe the actionable step is just asking to have the conversation, right? And not necessarily having that huge conversation yet. What are some other people's thoughts about actionable steps? I see Malaya saying not telling people when my days off are. I think that's really valuable, right? Because that's your time for yourself. And if you want to involve other people into that time, that can be a choice that you make more intentionally versus everyone knowing what your time off is and feeling entitled to that time. I see Gina and Mary talking about having a mutual conversation, right? So being collaborative, asking for what you need, but while also asking for what the other person needs, whether that be your friend, a family member, a partner. I think that's a great step too, because they might have a need that they haven't communicated with you as well. Elise asks a great question. Advice for setting boundaries with people depending on their personality type, passive versus passive aggressive versus assertive. So one tool that I use with a lot of my clients that I think is useful in setting boundaries is a tool called the ARC method. So the A stands for acknowledging your part, R stands for reporting an issue, and C is collaborating on a solution. So I think that works with most people. Ideally, not all of us can be assertive in our communication, but assertive communication is generally the most productive when it's available. But with A, acknowledging your part. So say the situation is that you need the kitchen for an hour to make yourself a meal. A, acknowledging your part. If it's not something you've ever asked for before, you might acknowledge, to say I'm talking to Gina, I might say, hey, Gina, I know that I've never made this request before. I know that I've never asked for us to use the kitchen. So that's me acknowledging my part. R, reporting the issue. But I'd really like to have the kitchen for an hour and I haven't had that time on Sundays. C, collaborating on a solution. Is there a time that I can have the kitchen for an hour? Are there any issues that you're foreseeing happening where I can't use the kitchen? So with A, acknowledging your part, that you can bring up an issue with someone while also letting them know that it's a two-person situation. Reporting the issue, you acknowledge what the challenge is without name calling, without defensiveness, right? Without any sort of critical language. You're just reporting the behavior or the need, not necessarily a character attack. And C, collaborating on a solution, you're allowing yourself and that other person to both feel heard in how to solve the problem. I see in the chat someone also talking about, I'm just venting, I don't need advice. I'm thinking that might be related to how we best want to be listened to, right? Sometimes there's problems and we just want to be able to talk about it. And sometimes there's problems and we want support. So naming, hey, I need to vent right now, or naming, hey, do you have any ideas on how to solve this problem, can be a great way to start a conversation if that's something you're having struggles with. I'm seeing a lot of great tools just flying in, so I hope that everyone's having an opportunity to look at them. All right. So because this is an aSweatLife presentation, I thought it'd be valuable to do some callbacks to various resources that aSweatLife has put out about therapy and mental health. aSweatLife has an entire mental health section on the site, and there's so many resources available, some about how to find a therapist, some about what teletherapy is, how to prepare for a therapy session. So definitely take a look at that. And then this other presentation is affordable therapy resources. So I want to take a moment to kind of look through these. So something you can do on Psychology Today and with Google is looking up therapists who have a sliding scale. So therapy is expensive, unfortunately. It's not as accessible or affordable for everybody. But you can look for therapists who are able to slide their scale for your income level. Another resource that's really useful is Open Path Collective. Generally speaking, their sessions are $30 to $60 a week, which is kind of comparable to what a lot of people's copays are if you don't have insurance. Therapyden.com is similar to openpathcollective.org. As far as people who are in the BIPOC community, there are resources. Therapyforblackgirls.com has resources where there's therapists who are Black or who are ethnically within the Black family, and who a lot of people who are Black, Latinx, other ethnicities, it can be really valuable to have a therapist who understands your lived experience of a various racial or ethnic background. So that's a resource there, similar with therapyforblackmen.org. Beam, www.beam.community is Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. So that resource has a lot of mental health resources for those who are in the BIPOC community. Therapyforlatinx.com is geared towards people who are in the Latinx community. Pridecounseling.com is specifically for folks who are in the LGBTQIA community. And lastly, the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network is a resource for people who are queer and trans who are people of color. So I wanted to include those because I know that finding a therapist who's affirming for your identity is really challenging at times, because therapists are oftentimes, unfortunately, white women. And there's not a lot of people out there who match other people's needs. So definitely hope that those resources are useful for people who need them. All right. So thank you everyone for listening. I apologize for the chaos that is my home. And if you want to reach out to me, my email is skelly@claritychai.com. My Psychology Today profile is linked there, and you can find me on Instagram at that handle.
Sarah, will you drop those links in the chat?
Yes, I will.
And then Erin, if you want to drop your Instagram and your website in the chat one more time too, before we log off. Guys, that was awesome. I had such a good time listening and participating when I did. So thank you guys, and thank you for keeping the chat rolling. I think it's always a lot more fun when I get to read and when we get to all do this together. So thank you guys for being active and willing participants. We'll share all of this stuff in the Slack channel here probably in like 20 or 30 minutes as soon as it uploads. Erin, Sarah, anything else you want to say?
Thank you everyone for listening. It's interesting talking about therapy and trying to do a group with, several people. So I appreciate everyone for being present here.
For sure. Erin?
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. I was just going through the chat, and I just feel so energized to just be among such a great group of people who are committed to doing this work. It always just fills me up. So thank you so much for your participation.